Hello everyone and welcome back to New News. I'm Marc Ramson.
And I'm Andrew Furman.
Google, Facebook, Twitter. The dialogue over these companies' rights to censor its users has grown massively over the past few years. And as their membership continues to rise, the problem only continues to get worse. The debate can be boiled down to one question. Do these large private companies have the right to censor its users on any basis? Or are members of the platforms protected by the First Amendment because of the control these platforms have over how we communicate today? In May of 2020, an executive order signed by then President Trump removed all protections that social media companies had from being sued over the content that was posted on their website. Though the action of removing these protections through executive order and not through Congress is questionable from a legal perspective, the reasoning behind this decision was clear. In a press conference following the decision, President Trump stated, quote, "A small handful of social media monopolies control a vast portion of all public and private communications in the United States," end quote. These protections that have since been removed had little to do with censorship, but the idea still stands. How much power should these companies have, and what should the federal government's role be in stepping in to protect their users from violations of the principles of freedom of speech?
The feud that existed between President Trump and social media companies continued in January after he was deplatformed on many of the most popular social media outlets. Under the law, because these companies are private entities and these bans are not being made by the government, the First Amendment does not apply. But if social media is to be treated as part of the public square, it's important to discover exactly what speech is and isn't protected under the First Amendment. There are situations in which the Supreme Court has deemed it constitutional to restrict speech, depending on the facts surrounding the situation. On January 6, Facebook locked Donald Trump's account after the U.S. Capitol building was stormed, alleging that Trump's words had directly incited the mob. This then triggered a series of events unfolding over a few weeks, involving Facebook deleting Trump's messages, as well as several other social media companies acting to suspend his accounts. There are arguments for and against justification of the censorship, but a question remains. Would Trump's actions be considered heinous enough for his speech to be banned, even under the First Amendment protections? If the case were to go to court, one argument in favor of the ban would be that Trump was responsible for spreading a large amount of false information. While false information is not illegal, it is not seen to be as valuable as other speech in a court of law, especially if that false information leads to harm. There's also an argument that his speech incited the mob and the ensuing violence, which would also justify the ban, and inciting violence is not protected under the First Amendment. In arguing against the ban, speech that is characterized as political speech is highly protected and is seen as highly valuable speech. In fact, the court has defended this speech over a large variety of cases. This could mean that, in the interest of maintaining protection over political speech, the ban could be considered unconstitutional. This exact debate over whether or not President Trump incited violence is what led to his second impeachment.
Just months after the backlash of the banning of President Trump, Facebook continues to make noise after they refuse to comply with Australia's new regulations. In order to benefit publishers, a new Australian law requires social media platforms to provide compensation to the publishers they shared links from. Google complied with their new regulations and maintained their relations with Australian users. Facebook, on the other hand, responded by removing the ability for any Australian account from sharing news source on their platform, barred any Australian news source to be shared anywhere in the world, and also deleted any previous posts that contained news sources. The ban essentially blacklisted all of Australia's news sources and was detrimental to any and all publishing based in the country. After facing heavy backlash, Facebook has since rescinded this decision, but following this great display of power over the spreading of information, this is likely going to be the starting point for conversations surrounding future regulations over the companies. This event also showed that these companies do own the content produced on their platform, leaving many people who rely on these outlets as a way of making a living unprotected in the event that any of these companies decide to do anything similar to this again. One potential solution to this problem is to act directly to diminish the power that these companies have. After an appearance by Mark Zuckerberg in front of a congressional subcommittee, a conversation was started over whether or not the federal government had the authority to step in and break up Facebook on account of their monopolistic qualities. There was presented evidence of the companies conspiring to violate antitrust laws, to buy and manipulate competition to ensure dominance over the market. While there are many members of Congress who would be in favor of such legislation, namely Elizabeth Warren, who made the policy a staple of her 2020 presidential campaign, there is also pushback from others who believe that breaking up the company would also cause unintended consequences.
While government entities flounder with how to handle social media platforms, Facebook has taken it upon themselves to regulate their censorship. The company has formally launched their Oversight Board, taking the power of censorship out of the hands of Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg. The Oversight Board consists of law professors, free speech scholars, human rights activists, and even the former Prime Minister of Denmark. Together, this team now has the power to dictate what is or is not acceptable content on Facebook's platform. The board will have full discretion over what cases they will rule on, providing an additional layer of oversight on Facebook executives. While the Oversight Board does not deal with the day-to-day responsibilities of the Facebook moderation team, members of the Oversight Board feel the discretions and decisions that they make will have lasting and powerful ramifications. The chartering of this board signals to the world leaders that Facebook and other social media conglomerates will not wait for government regulation. Instead, the web companies rooted in individual expression feel they're better equipped to police themselves. This should come as no surprise to people, as web icons like Mark Zuckerberg frequently avoid government intervention like the plague, and would rather keep decision-making abilities in-house. The reality is companies like Facebook, who are used as a primary form of communication, now have more global clout than most countries. Free speech. Two outwardly simple words which combine to form one of the greatest philosophical conundrums of our present time. In many ways, private social media companies have not expanded or shrunk our freedom of speech, but rather presented it in a much different way, with a much wider audience. As tensions boil over, I am reminded of the days I would sit on my grandparents' couch and watch Star Trek. It seemed like every episode concluded with the lines, "Space, the final frontier." Now, this would confuse me, because while space was the final frontier, the planets and issues that arose with them seemed infinite. Free speech, and the ability to freely exchange ideas, is in many ways the final frontier in achieving as close to a utopian society as humanly possible. The only issue? This frontier has no ending.
Personally, I'm more of a To Infinity and Beyond guy myself, but Star Trek is cool too.
That's all for Nude News.
And remember, size only matters when it comes to poll numbers.
And maybe crowd sizes.
See you next week.